Why some people exhaust you. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the people who wear us down the fastest are rarely the strangers. They are almost always the ones who touch something we have never looked at in ourselves. Here is the premise, and I want you to sit with it before we go further. Jung wrote in Ion, paragraph 17, that projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. He was not being poetic. He was describing a mechanism. When you cannot see a piece of yourself, that piece does not vanish. It goes looking for a face to wear, and it finds one, usually in the person who happens to be standing closest. And Jung would stop you right here and say, "Do you see it?" The exhaustion you feel around certain people is rarely just about their behavior. It is about the unseen cargo you are carrying into the room before they even open their mouth. That is the ache underneath tonight's question. Why some people cost you so much more than the situation seems to justify. So let me give you something to say, not to fix it, but to turn toward it. I notice who drains me. I ask what in me answers their pull before I ask what is wrong with them. And I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I notice who drains me. I ask what in me answers their pull before I ask what is wrong with them. And I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I notice who drains me. I ask what in me answers their pull before I ask what is wrong with them. And I make the unconscious conscious. And if you would like tomorrow's teaching to find you the way tonight's did, consider staying close by subscribing. So the next fire we sit by is one you do not miss. Before the first key, do this one small thing for me. Type the words "face it" in the comments. Not as a performance, just as a marker. A way of saying, something in this named a weight I have been carrying without a name. If something in you just went quiet a moment ago, let those two words be your seal. The first key is, the exhaustion is a hook, and the hook is real. Jung made a careful distinction that most people skip past. He said one meets with projections, one does not make them, meaning this. The other person is not an empty screen. They carry something, a tone, a gesture, a way of withdrawing or demanding, that snags on something already coiled inside you. This is why the same co-worker who exhausts you leaves your friend completely unbothered. It is not that your friend is more patient. It is that your friend has no hook waiting to be caught. Imagine two people sitting in the same meeting. The same slightly arrogant man holds forth. One colleague finds him mildly tiresome and moves on with her afternoon. The other goes home replaying every sentence, feeling something close to rage. The man did not do two different things. He did one thing, and it landed on two different unconscious floors. This is not to say the exhausting person is imaginary, or that you are simply too sensitive. That is not the teaching. The teaching is narrower and stranger than that. It is that your particular exhaustion is information. It is pointing at a coiled place in you that this person, and maybe only this person, knows how to touch. It is not weakness that you feel it. It is not that you are the fragile one. It is that the encounter is doing two jobs at once. One visible, one hidden. And the hidden one is the reason the tiredness follows you home long after the conversation ends. Consider a small ordinary example. A man who dreads calling his own brother, not because the brother is cruel, the brother is only a little careless with his words, forgets birthdays, talks over him at dinner, and yet the man hangs up the phone, feeling as though something has been taken from him. He cannot explain it to his wife that evening. He only knows he needs an hour alone before he can speak to anyone else in the house. That is the hook, working exactly as Jung described it. The brother supplied one careless sentence, and the man's own unconscious supplied the other 9/10 of the weight. This is worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because most of us were taught to ask only one question after a draining encounter: what did they do wrong? And Jung is asking us to add a second question, quieter, harder. What in me was already waiting for exactly that? Not instead of the first question, but alongside it. The hook is real. The person really did knock, but the room that opened when they knocked was already yours, already furnished, already holding something with a name it had not yet been given. So before you decide the exhaustion is entirely about them, notice only this, that a hook needs two things to work: a hand that throws it, and flesh willing to catch it, and only one of those two is standing in front of you, I do not exhaust easily. I exhaust precisely. And precisely means there is something to read. The second key is, disproportion is the tell. If a person exhausts everyone equally, that may simply be their manner, their volume, their neediness. That is a fact about them, plain and external. But if a person exhausts you far past what the room seems to justify, if others shrug while you are quietly gritting your teeth, that gap is not proof you are right and they are blind. The gap is the exact size of what belongs to you, and Jung would ask you to measure it honestly before you measure them. Imagine a woman at work who has a colleague everyone finds mildly grating, easy enough to work around, a small rolling of the eyes and then back to the task. But for her, this same colleague is unbearable. She dreads the meeting's days in advance. She rehearses arguments with him in the shower. She brings him up to her partner at dinner more often than she brings up her own actual work. One evening, a friend outside the office asks her, plainly, and without any edge, what exactly does he do? And she opens her mouth to answer, and finds the answer is smaller than the feeling. He interrupts sometimes. He takes credit sometimes. Other people at that office do both of those things too, and barely register on anyone's radar. The disproportion is the clue she almost let pass her by. Her reaction is larger than his offense, and something that large is rarely only about him. Notice how this differs from simple annoyance. Annoyance fades when the person leaves the room. This does not fade. It follows her into the car, into the shower, into the dinner conversation. That persistence past the actual encounter is itself a signal. It means the charge did not originate in the 20 minutes of contact. It was already loaded before he ever opened his mouth. And there is a second way to run this same test, not just against the room, but against yourself across time. Ask whether your own reaction today matches your reaction to similar smaller offenses last month or last year. Most people assume their feelings scale evenly with the offense. A small slight produces a small sting. A large slight produces a large one. But exhaustion does not obey that arithmetic. Sometimes a genuinely large offense leaves you barely touched. You shrug. You move on. And sometimes a genuinely small offense, a forgotten reply, a slightly clipped tone, leaves you replaying it for 3 days. When the reaction and the offense stop matching in size, something else is doing the measuring, and it is worth asking plainly what that something else might be. Consider, too, how disproportion often hides behind the excuse of justification. We are skilled at building a case after the fact. The mind supplies extra reasons the person truly is that bad, extra memories of other times they were careless, so that the size of the feeling always seems to match the size of the crime once we have finished arguing for it. Jung would ask you to notice the argument itself as a symptom. If you find yourself building an elaborate case to justify an already enormous reaction, the elaborateness of the case is itself the tell. Small offenses do not usually require long arguments to explain the fury they produce. Only large unclaimed feelings do that. Jung would ask her to sit with an uncomfortable question. Where else in my life have I been interrupted and said nothing? Where else have I watched credit slip away from me without a single word of protest? The exhausting colleague may simply be standing in the exact spot where an old unclaimed anger has been waiting, patiently, for a name. This is not an excuse for him, and it is not a demand that she like him or make peace with his habits. It is only an honest account of why he costs her more than he costs anyone else in that building. The same test works everywhere. The relative who exhausts you far more than your siblings. The friend whose small selfishness undoes you while it barely touches anyone else at the table. The stranger in a meeting whose tone makes your whole body tighten while your colleague beside you did not even notice he had spoken sharply. In every case, the question is the same. Not is my reaction fair to them, but is my reaction the right size for what actually happened? And if it is not the right size, where is the rest of that weight actually stored? I measure the size of my reaction before I measure the size of their offense. The third key is, the mechanism underneath the hook is what Jung called the imago, and it is worth slowing down here, because most people have felt its effects for years without ever learning its name. An imago is not a memory in the ordinary sense. It is not a photograph you can pull out and examine. It is closer to a mold, formed early, usually in childhood, out of the emotional residue of the people who mattered most. A parent's tone right before punishment, a sibling's particular way of dismissing you, a teacher's flat, disappointed stare. These do not stay filed as single events. They fuse together into a kind of composite figure, a template, and that template goes looking for matches for the rest of your life. It is patient. It does not need an exact copy. It only needs a rough resemblance, a certain pitch of voice, a certain pause before a criticism, a certain way of turning away mid-sentence. And once the resemblance is close enough, the old mold slides over the new face like a hand into a glove that was shaped years before the hand ever grew. Imagine a man in his 40s who dreads, almost physically, any meeting with his landlord. The landlord is not cruel. He is simply brisk, a little clipped, quick to move the conversation along without much warmth. But this man leaves every exchange feeling small, oddly ashamed, as though he has done something wrong, he cannot say what. One evening, almost by accident, he realizes the landlord's clipped voice is nearly identical in rhythm to his father's voice on the evenings when dinner had gone quiet. When something was owed and not yet said, the landlord has never met his father. The landlord knows nothing of this, and yet the man's nervous system has quietly filed him under the same heading. This is the imago at work. Not a delusion, not an exaggeration, but an old mold pressed onto a new and mostly innocent face. Jung recalled traveling to the American Southwest and speaking with a Pueblo chief named Ochwe Biano, who told him plainly that the whites always want something. They are always uneasy and restless. And Jung wrote that in that moment he saw something of his own European face reflected back at him from outside, a face he had never gotten a clean look at while standing inside it. That is the strange gift hiding inside every exhausting encounter. The other person, standing at just the right angle, shows you an old shape you have carried so long you stopped noticing you were carrying it at all. Notice too that the imago rarely announces itself with a face you would recognize as the original. It comes disguised. Sometimes it wears the opposite manner entirely. A woman who grew up with a withholding, silent mother may find herself strangely undone, not by silence, but by a chatty, warm co-worker who never quite lets her finish a sentence. On the surface, nothing matches. And yet underneath, the old feeling of never being fully heard has found a new doorway to walk through. The imago is less interested in surface detail than in the exact emotional note it is hunting for. And here is the harder part. The part willpower cannot touch. You cannot simply decide to stop seeing the old face. You cannot lecture yourself into fairness. The mold was built silently, over years, and it dissolves the same way, slowly, through repeated honest noticing, rather than a single flash of insight. Ask yourself, plainly, when this person speaks to me, whose voice am I actually hearing? When this person goes quiet, whose silence am I actually afraid of? Most of the time, the honest answer surprises you. It is rarely the landlord, rarely the co-worker, rarely even the friend who keeps disappointing you. It is someone much older, much further back, still running the meeting from behind a curtain. Picture the exhaustion as a debt collector, knocking at the same door, in the same tone, until the actual debt gets acknowledged, not paid to the person in front of you, but acknowledged quietly in yourself. Until then, the knocking simply changes addresses. This exhausting person retires from your life, and a new one takes the post within months, wearing a slightly different face, but ringing the exact same old bell. And you find yourself saying, almost embarrassed, why does this keep happening to me? When the truer question was always waiting underneath, whose face have I been quietly rehanging on strangers? I look for the old face hiding behind the new one before I decide who is truly in front of me. The fourth key is, this is why the tiredness is not merely emotional, it is structural. It costs actual labor. When you are relating honestly to a real person, there is only one job to do: meet them, respond, move on. But when a projection is running, there are two jobs happening at once, and you are doing both without extra pay. The first job is managing the actual interaction, the words, the schedule, the shared task. The second job Invisible, unpaid, and exhausting is holding together the old unconscious image so it does not fall apart in front of you, keeping the story consistent, keeping the villain villainous or the rival rivalrous, so the internal picture does not have to be revised. That second job is the one draining your reserves, not the meeting itself. Imagine your week. Monday, you brace before a call with someone who always seems to talk over you. Tuesday, you replay the call twice. Wednesday, you mention them to a friend with more heat than the story deserves. Thursday, you catch yourself dreading Friday's meeting before Friday has even arrived. By the time Friday comes, you have spent 4 days doing unpaid labor for an old imago and only 20 minutes actually speaking to the real, current, breathing person. That ratio is the exhaustion. 4 days of upkeep for 20 minutes of contact. And notice something else about this labor. It is not idle. It is active maintenance. The way a stagehand keeps rushing behind a curtain to hold up a set that keeps threatening to topple. Every time the real person says something that does not fit the old story, a small crew inside you rushes in to patch the scenery. They said something almost kind today. Quick, remember the time they were not. They agreed with you in the meeting. Quick, remember that this surely does not count. This patchwork is exhausting precisely because it never finishes. The real person keeps living, keeps changing in small ways day to day, and the unconscious keeps having to run back and repair the old image against the evidence. Imagine a man whose brother was cruel to him in childhood, and who now finds his brother, decades later, mildly overbearing at holidays. Nothing more. But every visit costs him a week of dread beforehand, and a week of low-grade irritation afterward. He is not lying about the exhaustion. The exhaustion is real, but most of it is upkeep. The actual overbearing comment might last 4 minutes at dinner. The rest of the week is spent guarding an old verdict from being overturned by a person who is, in this smaller present moment, mostly harmless. This is the quiet arithmetic Jung was pointing toward. The bill is rarely for what happened. It is for what has to be kept standing, so that what happened long ago still makes sense. I do not pay twice for one meeting. I notice when the bill has been padded by an old story. The fifth key is the turn, and I want to walk it slowly, because this is the one that changes how the whole question sits in you. First, consider that up to now we have been speaking about them. The exhausting colleague, the demanding relative, the friend who calls only when they need something. But Jung's whole argument, quietly, is that this conversation was never really about them. The projection tells you far more about the projector than the object it lands on. So let the lens turn, gently, not as an accusation, but as an honest question, held a moment longer than usual. Who exhausts me? And what does that person know how to touch in me that almost no one else can reach? Second, consider that the people who exhaust you fall roughly into 2 families, and it matters which family you are dealing with. The first family carries a quality you despise. The person who talks over you touches your own unclaimed anger at having been silenced once. Long before this person arrived, the second family carries a quality you secretly envy. The person who seems effortlessly confident, unbothered by opinion, endlessly at ease. This kind of exhausting person is often not repellent at all. They are magnetic and irritating at once, because they are living some freedom you quietly gave up long ago. Both families exhaust you, but they are teaching different lessons. One about an old wound, the other about a buried gift. Imagine a man who cannot stand his brother-in-law at family gatherings. The brother-in-law is loud about his own small successes, and everyone else at the table finds him merely tiring, easy enough to nod along with. But this one man leaves every holiday drained for days, and if you asked him why, he could not quite say, only that something about the bragging makes him want to leave the room. The honest answer, uncomfortable as it is, may be that somewhere inside him lives an old ambition he abandoned early, a version of himself who wanted to be seen and decided it was safer not to want that. The brother-in-law is not the wound, he is only standing where the light happens to fall on it. Third, consider a full day, hour by hour, because the mechanism is easiest to see laid out plainly. 7 in the morning, you wake already thinking of the person, rehearsing what they might say. 9 in the morning. You see their name on your calendar and your stomach tightens before a single word has been exchanged. 11 in the morning. The meeting happens. 20 minutes. Ordinary, forgettable even. 1 in the afternoon. At lunch, you tell a friend the story again, adding heat the actual meeting did not contain. 4 in the afternoon. You are tired, genuinely tired, though nothing physically demanding has happened to you all day. 6 in the evening. You snap at someone entirely unrelated, a partner, a child, a stranger in traffic, and only later do you realize the irritation had nowhere else to go. 8 at night. Lying down. You replay a sentence they said, turning it over, finding new offense in it that was not there this morning. Notice, across that whole day, the actual contact with the real, current, breathing human being took 20 minutes, and the unconscious upkeep took the other 15 hours. That is not an exaggeration. That is the arithmetic of a projection left unexamined. And notice too how it leaked, how the tiredness did not stay contained to the one relationship, but spilled sideways onto people who did nothing at all to earn it. Fourth, consider what Jung meant when he wrote that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. That line was written about complexes generally, but it applies with unusual precision here. An unowned quality does not stay quietly inside you waiting to be noticed. It goes out and arranges itself as an encounter, as a person, as a recurring type who shows up in office after office, relationship after relationship, wearing slightly different clothes but ringing the exact same bell. You have likely noticed this already, without having language for it. The same kind of person keeps appearing. A different name, a different face, the same exhausting shape. Perhaps it was a cold parent once, then a cold teacher, then a cold manager, then a cold partner. And each time you swore this one would be different, and each time some old familiar weight settled in anyway. That repetition is not bad luck, and it is not proof the world is simply full of difficult people. It is a pattern trying to get your attention long enough to finally be seen. Fifth, and this is the piece I want you to actually try, not later, but sometime this week. Pause for a moment and pick one real person who exhausts you. Not the mildest one, the true one. The one whose name alone makes your shoulders rise. Take a page and write, at the top, what quality in them costs me the most. Then underneath, write honestly whether that quality is one you despise in yourself or one you secretly wish you were permitted to have. Then go one step further. Write down the earliest person you can remember who carried that same quality, a parent, an older sibling, a childhood friend, and notice whether the feeling you have now is really the size of today's offense, or whether it is borrowing weight from somewhere much older. Do not rush the answer. Sit with it the way you would sit with a stone in your shoe. Uncomfortable, but informative. This is not therapy, and it is not a diagnosis of them or of you. It is simply an honest inventory, the kind Jung asked his patients to keep, an irritation inventory, so the unconscious cargo stops traveling incognito. Sixth, and last within this key, understand what withdrawing a projection actually feels like when it finally happens. It is rarely dramatic. There is no fireworks moment. It feels instead like a small deflation. The person becomes, almost disappointingly, ordinary. Their old power over your nervous system quietly drains away. The loud brother-in-law is simply a man who talks too much at dinner. The demanding manager is simply a tired person doing a difficult job badly. And what is left, once the ghost has been set down, is only the actual size of the actual person. Sometimes still difficult, sometimes still someone you would not choose to spend an evening with, but no longer haunted, no longer carrying 15 hours of unpaid labor on their shoulders for a debt they never truly created. That deflation is not a loss, it is the return of your own energy, previously spent maintaining a ghost. I would rather meet an ordinary person honestly than an old ghost endlessly. The sixth key is, none of this asks you to excuse genuine harm, or to stay near someone who is actually crossing a real boundary. Jung's teaching on projection was never a demand that you tolerate mistreatment, because some of the charge is yours. And I want to be careful here. because this is the place where a true teaching gets twisted into a bad one. Some situations are simply what they appear to be. A person who lies to you is lying. A person who takes without asking is taking. Honesty about your own contribution does not cancel honesty about theirs. And no amount of inner work turns a genuine wrong into a misunderstanding. Imagine a woman who spends a year quietly telling herself that her own unclaimed anger is the whole reason a certain relative exhausts her. She keeps an inventory. She asks the honest questions, and still, every visit leaves her smaller. Still, every conversation ends with her apologizing for things she did not do. At some point, the honest teaching is not more self-examination. It is simply this: some doors cost too much to keep answering. And closing one is not a failure of the work, it is the work arriving at a plain conclusion. Picture a different scene, an ordinary one. A small office where two co-workers share a desk area. One of them borrows things without asking. A stapler, a charger. A few minutes of your attention, right when you are trying to finish something. Most days you let it go. Some days it costs you real focus. And the honest work here is simply naming the pattern plainly to yourself. This is a small friction, not a war. And it does not require you to excavate your childhood every single time someone borrows your stapler without asking. Some exhaustion really is that ordinary. And treating every small friction as a doorway into the depths of the unconscious is its own kind of exhaustion. A person can be a little careless and nothing more. So hold both truths without letting either one swallow the other. Look first at the hook. Yes, ask what old face is being worn by this new one. Yes, but let the looking be honest enough to also see plainly when the hook is the smaller story and the harm in front of you is the larger one. Notice too that even the ordinary irritations deserve a plain word said once, kindly, rather than a decade of silent tallying. A short sentence to the co-worker costs less than a year of quiet resentment. For the ordinary exhaustion, though, the kind that follows you home from meetings that were not actually cruel, from relatives who are not actually monsters, from acquaintances who are simply a little much, the invitation stands quietly. Keep the irritation inventory, not as a punishment, but as a lantern you carry into your own rooms, and notice, gently, that every time you withdraw one thread of an old projection, the world gets a little quieter, not because people change, but because you are no longer doing unpaid labor in every room you enter. Picture that candle on the table, steady, small, enough to see by, while the old storm you used to mistake for the whole sky simply fades at the edges of the room. That quiet is not indifference, and it is not resignation either. It is energy finally returned to its rightful owner. The same energy you spent for years guarding an old ghost, now free to be spent on the life actually in front of you. Some ghosts deserve to be examined by lantern light, and some doors simply deserve to be closed. The wisdom is knowing, each time, which one is standing in front of you. I let the exhausting ones teach me, then I keep the lesson and set the ghost down. Here is the whole picture. The hook is real, but it lands because something in you answers it. Disproportion tells you the size of what is yours. The imago is the old face hiding behind the new one. The exhaustion is the cost of doing two jobs when only one was ever necessary. The turn is realizing the pattern was never truly about them. It was the unclaimed parts of you, arranging themselves as fate, and the mercy at the end is that none of it condemns you, or them. It simply asks you to look. All 6 of these were never 6 separate keys at all. They were one single turning. Meet the hook, trace it home, and stop paying twice for a single encounter. I notice who drains me. I ask what in me answers their pull before I ask what is wrong with them. And I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I notice who drains me. I ask what in me answers their pull before I ask what is wrong with them. And I make the unconscious conscious. So the next time someone leaves you inexplicably tired, before you decide entirely what they cost you, ask instead what old, unclaimed face of your own just looked back at you through theirs.